The people of Ukraine have faced more than their fair share of challenges and turmoil since the country gained independence from the Soviet Union. The Cold War may have ended, but the emergent Russia, first ruled by Boris Yeltsin and then Vladimir Putin, remained Western Europe's primary opponent. Ukraine was caught in the middle. The country remained tied to Russia in many ways, but much of its population yearned for the economic growth and opportunities afforded by the European Union. In 2014, the issue hit boiling point, bubbling over into regional conflict and, at the time of the video's production, an ongoing war for national survival. This is the recent history of Ukraine and the bloody war that is still claiming the lives of its people today. Ukraine gained independence from the Soviet Union on December 1st, 1991, after 84% of Ukrainians voted for it in a national referendum. The country quickly became politically separate from Russia, and people were optimistic about the future. Economists across Europe believed Ukraine was the strongest contender for economic growth and European integration under capitalism. They were wrong. Between 1991 and 1999, Ukrainians saw their once bustling economy deteriorate and their industries disappear. During the Soviet era, Ukrainian factories had produced much of the Union's consumer goods and most of its weapons. Once the Iron Curtain was lifted, these industries collapsed. The global market for consumer goods was suddenly opened to citizens of the ex-Soviet republics, and Ukrainian goods weren't selling. Uncompetitive factories were closed and entrepreneurs bought up much of the disused Soviet machinery to sell for scrap. They made a quick grivna, but only served to undermine the Ukrainian economy further. In those 9 years, the light industrial output fell by 95%. Machine manufacturing, one of Ukraine's major industries, fell by 90%. Even steel and coal production, a traditionally secure fallback industry, declined by over 50%. Old Soviet supply chains were in disarray, the consumer market had evaporated, and the supply of essentially free energy in the form of Russian gas had dried up. Hope for the future had become a scarce commodity. Economic woes exacerbated political tensions and a split formed down the middle of Ukraine. Russian-speaking Ukrainians of the urbanized eastern regions, particularly Donbas and Crimea, felt that protections afforded to them under the Soviet regime were evaporating. Culturally distinct Ukrainians of the predominantly rural western regions saw the fall of the USSR as a golden opportunity to reignite Ukrainian nationalism. Each side consolidated their supporters behind political candidates, and a clear split between pro-Western and pro-Russian politicians emerged. Leonid Kuchma held the reins of power from 1994 to 2005. During his second term as president, his tax reforms kick-started economic recovery. But Kuchma wasn't perfect. From 1998 to 2000, his bodyguards secretly recorded him agreeing to sell military tech to Saddam Hussein and sanctioning a journalist's execution. The bodyguard released the recordings when the police discovered the journalist's headless corpse. Kuchma's alleged involvement in the murder was dubbed Kuchmagate by the press and effectively put him out of the running for the next election. Viktor Yanukovych ran in his place on a pro-Russia platform. He was endorsed by Kuchma and sponsored by Russia's Vladimir Putin. Against him ran Viktor Yushchenko, who represented the interests of Ukraine's western regions and supported closer ties with NATO. Yushchenko was also strongly anti-corruption. Yanukovych won the election by a small margin, but many international observers and Ukrainian citizens believed the election had been rigged. Thousands of protesters massed in the streets and demanded a second vote in what became known as the Orange Revolution. Ukraine's parliament passed a vote of no confidence in the cabinet, but Yanukovych refused to cooperate. The Ukrainian Supreme Court was forced to break the deadlock and ordered another vote. This was heavily scrutinized by international observers and declared to be free and fair. Yushchenko won, alienating many in Ukraine's east. They didn't see the Orange Revolution as a return to democracy, but a usurpation of power by a Western bloc backed by the EU. Legitimate or not, the result was the same. Ukraine grew closer to the EU and the Easterners felt marginalized. Their resentment toward the government in Kiev grew. In 2008, the global financial crisis hit, and it had massive ramifications. One of these was a drop in the demand for steel, which at the time was one of Ukraine's primary exports. Prices fell and investors pulled out, causing the Ukrainian economy to tank for the second time in 20 years. Reports of corruption circulated in the press and Yushchenko's credibility plummeted. In 2010, Yanukovych made a comeback and won the presidency on a platform of Russian-aligned economic growth and stability. Allegations abounded that the election was fraudulent, but it wasn't overturned. Over the next few years, Yanukovych pulled Ukraine closer to Russia, but revolution was brewing, and this decision proved to be his undoing. On November 21st, 2013, the Ukrainian government made an abrupt about-face and refused to sign the European Union-Ukraine Association Agreement, which had been in the works for years. In response, 2,000 protesters appeared on Maidan Square in Kiev. On November 26, Moscow admitted that they had deliberately stalled the deal to keep Ukraine within their sphere of influence. This was not what many in Kiev wanted, and the protest swelled to 200,000 people, many of whom were students. They chanted "Ukraine is Europe" and waved EU flags. A Twitter hashtag associated with the protest soon became its official name, Euromaidan. Yanukovych tried appeasement, but the movement grew. It was soon no longer about a simple trade deal. Euromaidan became a rally against corruption, oligarchy, and Russian dominion. In Kiev, at least. In Donbas, people had a markedly different view. Yet again, they saw a foreign elite trying to usurp power in the capital. Division in Ukraine was deepening, and the Easterners began to feel their country was slipping away. As Euromaidan wore on, Yanukovych deployed increasingly aggressive measures to break it up. On November 30th, he sent in special riot police who hospitalized scores of protesters. The organizers' phones were also hacked and communications blacked out. Determined to resist, the protesters dug in. They erected impressive barricades and created ad hoc suits of armor. The police were extremely heavy-handed, and the protesters often fought back fiercely. Euromaidan continued to escalate for 3 months until on February 18th, it reached a crescendo. Behind a vanguard of armored shield bearers, the protesters advanced on the Capitol building. Police snipers were deployed on the rooftops and poured live rounds into the crowd. Over 100 civilians were killed. As footage from people's phones spread over social media, the world bore witness to the atrocity. On February 21st, Yanukovych signed an agreement with the leaders of the opposition. Observers from the EU and Russia were present and expressed their support and outrage. Yanukovych fled to Russia and the protesters took control of the presidential buildings as well as Yanukovych's luxurious private estate. Euromaidan achieved its goals and became known by many as the Revolution of Dignity, but it represented nothing less than a slap in the face for Russia and the many Russian-aligned Ukrainians living in Crimea and the eastern regions. Lest he be shown up by a bunch of students with homemade armor in Kiev, Putin had to act. He had an all-night meeting with his security staff on February 22nd and 23rd, after which he remarked, "We must start working on returning Crimea to Russia." Hours later, pro-Russian demonstrations began in Sevastopol, Crimea's main city, and Kerch. Demonstrators got into a fistfight with the mayor when they tried to replace the Crimean flag with the Russian one. Pro-Russian demonstrations popped up across the peninsula, and those in power declared that they would ignore the new regime in Kiev. On February 27th, Russian soldiers and associated paramilitary units marched into Crimea. The soldiers had removed their patches and wore no flags, but were clearly Russian. The media dubbed them Little Green Men. They captured Crimea's parliament that day, installing the Russian politician Sergei Aksyonov as prime minister of the region. Soon after, there was a media blackout, and Aksyonov requested Putin's help in restoring order to Crimea. He got it, and by March 26, the annexation was complete. While technically a military invasion, the takeover of Crimea didn't carry the same connotations as later Russian invasions of Ukraine. For starters, most people in Crimea felt they were Russian. Russian was spoken in place of Ukrainian, and cultural links to Moscow were often tighter than links to Kiev. Day to day, people's lives changed little after the annexation of Crimea. The EU responded with economic sanctions, but effectively let Putin off the hook when demonstrations in Crimea settled down. But things were different in Donbas. People who had voted for Yanukovych to bring them closer to Russia could only watch as their political power was stripped away by a revolution they were firmly against. When the Russian language lost its status as an official language of Ukraine, these same people were appalled. Grassroots protests held against the pro-EU regime appeared across the regions of Donetsk and Luhansk. The authorities cracked down and arrested the organizers. This left a power vacuum that was quickly filled by people with genuine links to the Russian military, Russian businesses, and Russian politics. By April, Russians controlled the pro-Russian movement in eastern Ukraine and were receiving volunteers, weapons, and intelligence from their allies just across the border. On April 7th, protesters marched on the central administration buildings in Donetsk and Luhansk. They demanded independence from the Kiev regime under the threat of war. Days later, on May 11th, the secessionist leadership organized a referendum. Unsurprisingly, the results turned out wildly in their favor, but Ukraine was not willing to lose even more territory to Russia. The Ukrainian army was mobilized and conscription reinstated. Troops massed at key points around the breakaway region, and planners envisioned a swift and brutal assault. Putin responded with his hybrid approach. Russian-made weapons flowed into Ukraine, and regular and irregular pro-Russian soldiers began popping up everywhere. The stage was set. The soldiers were armed and ready. In April-May 2014, the war between Russia and Ukraine began. But what do you think? Do you think the EU should have responded more harshly to the annexation of Crimea? Do you think the conflict would have happened without the Orange Revolution? Do you think the war in Ukraine was inevitable, or could better planning have prevented the situation? Let us know all that and more in the comment section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new.